Welcome everybody. I'm Robert Johansson. I'm the chair of the Australia-India Institute, and welcome to all of you who are here today for this lecture on Modi in Oz. So the plan for today is that Professor Mattoo will speak for a while, 20 minutes or perhaps a bit longer, and then we'll have some time for discussion, questions, comments. The event's being live streamed, so if any of you who are watching this from not here do have any comments or questions, please send them to us through our Twitter account at AI Institute. And today's address is hashtag Modi in Oz. So it has been a momentous week in the history or in the sequence of Australian-India relations. The visit of the Prime Minister has generated extraordinary interest and we think momentum. A book on the history of Australian-Indian diplomatic relationships is going to be published soon. Delighted to see Meg Gurry here today. Whether this will be another chapter or indeed a whole new book from now on, we'll need to see. But as I say, the enormous interest and that his visit attracted, and indeed how many of the certainties of India and its relationships with the external world seem to have been forgotten. The notion of India as a non-aligned state seems to have been the shift from which you would think would cause enormous angst and debate seems to have passed over as night follows the day. How strong that, how that will play out, whether that's a consistent theme from now on, the enthusiasm and the acceptance that there'll be a quickly negotiated free trade agreement. Well, I don't think any of us think that we should think that'll happen too quickly, but that there is no debate that trade in that way ought to be negotiated by India with the outside world is itself something that I don't think a year ago we would have thought was conceivable. So the visit has perhaps brought to our attention a lot of changes that are bubbling away and maybe will become possible. So, to talk about the implications, who better than Amitabh Mattoo? Professor Mattoo has been the director of the Australia-India Institute now for 3.5 years. And as I think many of you are aware, at the end of this calendar year or early in the new year, he will be going back to Delhi. I'm pleased to say he won't be lost to us. We are going to be establishing a presence in Delhi, the Australia-India Institute at Delhi, which Amitabh will head up for us. So he won't be lost to us, but this does represent, if not the last, one of the very last events at which he will deliver in his role in Melbourne as director of the Institute. As I'm sure everyone is aware, Amitabh's contribution to the relationship between Australia and India over the past 3.5 years has been, I think, unprecedented. He's made an enormous contribution, and indeed that we were able to gather together such an extraordinary list and group of people to interact with Prime Minister Modi on earlier this week. We had heads of major banks, of the world's major resource companies, extraordinary array of people that we were able to gather that together so quickly was, I think, in part due to the significance of the relationship that Amitabh has been able to draw attention to. So it's my great pleasure to invite Amitabh Mattoo to address us today.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you for your very kind words. And let me begin following Prime Minister Modi's stance at all his public meetings to recognize the traditional owners of the land that we are assembled here and to pay my respects to their ancestors present and departed. My Australian journey began as the director of the Institute with the Tiffin Talk that we had first organized in the chemistry building. We didn't have a home of our own. We had half a floor in the old arts building, and we used to organize our Tiffin Talks there, no live streaming, some free food. But all we could attract, I remember on the first occasion, was no more than 8 people. I think it's telling and it's a fitting narrative for the way in which this relationship has been transformed, that we are live streaming today's Tiffin Talk. There is no free food, and yet all of you have collected in such a large number. My talk when we conceived of this talk, I thought that I'll just talk about what happened when Prime Minister Modi visited Australia under the assumption that there would be no media coverage, that there would be a single-line column, which often happens when Indian leaders used to visit the United States, and indeed many countries in the West. Used to look, I remember when I was once in Washington, every India watcher used to look for a column somewhere in the New York Times which recognized that an Indian Prime Minister or a foreign minister had visited that country, and most of the time you couldn't find any reference. But I doubt whether there's someone in this room who hasn't been aware of Mr. Modi's phenomenal visit to this country. Every major newspaper, website has covered the visit fully. The Australian yesterday had Mr. Modi on the front page. The Fairfax Group, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age covered it widely. I think Judith Ireland described it as Mr. Modi's speech to Parliament as a rock star performance, and talked about how if Madam Speaker hadn't stopped the parliamentarians, they would have whistled and whooped and really gone up to stage, because that was the impact of Modi. Let me also say this, that I'm neither, before Modi's visit to Australia and before he became Prime Minister, I was neither a Modi Bhakt, as they say in Hindi, a Modi devotee, or a Modi beta. Because Modi, before he became Prime Minister, was seen as a Manichaean figure who would excite all sorts of passions. I am a liberal social scientist, at least that's what I hope most people see me as. So my view of Modi was not a prejudged one. I'm, I think, much more positivist rather than postmodernist, so I like to see evidence and then decide what is right and wrong. So really, my understanding of Modi is based on a larger context now, and I thought that would be useful for my presentation here today. So there are really 3 questions around which I frame Modi's visit, which is why India, why the world, and the bilateral relationship needed Modi. Why, if there wasn't a Narendra Modi, we might have almost had to invent a Narendra Modi. At this point of time in our history, given our global circumstances, given the situation in India, and given where bilateral relations are headed. So I'll begin by saying why India needed Modi. Narendra Modi, as you remember, won for the BJP the first time ever a majority on its own, but it was the first time any political party actually had won a majority in nearly 3 decades. For nearly 3 decades, India lived with coalition politics. India lived with the primacy most of the time of the Congress party. And India lived, again, most of the time with the shakiness that coalition politics can often bring to bear on a democracy. And yet, over the last 10 years particularly, you had a new generation of Indians coming to age, becoming first-time voters. As Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, pointed out several times during his visit, that there are more 500 to 600 million Indians under the age of 25. This is an India which was aspirational, which had been connected to the globe increasingly through mobile phones. Robert Jeffrey is here. He's written a book on about how mobile phones are transforming India. 800 million Indians, at last count, had mobile phones. Increasingly, there was greater penetration of the internet. So they were connected to the world. They had global aspirations, but they were living in an India which was increasingly dysfunctional, corrupt, and which did not seem to have the political system and a governing class who could satisfy the aspirations of this young India. This young India, therefore, was becoming increasingly angry and impatient. For a moment, there was hope in a new party which we all thought could break the mold of Indian politics through their mass movement against corruption, the Aam Aadmi Party and Arvind Kejriwal. But that hope died because it became clear that Mr. Kejriwal and the Aam Aadmi Party seemed to be more proficient in the politics of protest and agitation than the politics of providing real governance. The only hope then seemed to be Narendra Damodar Das Modi, a person who, although in the past had polarized public opinion because of the riots in Gujarat in 2002, yet seemed to have transformed that state. But there had been no communal riots, a state which had witnessed in the last 40 years, till 2002, riots after riots between Hindus and Muslims, no riots, much better governance, an investor-friendly economic environment, and most critically, Mr. Modi, with a squeaky clean Spartan image of someone who was authoritarian, but decisive, and there were no questions about his integrity and honesty. So there was this, as I said, 600 million young Indians, many of them first-time voters. They saw in Mr. Modi the person, the great hope who could probably deliver. Remember also, beyond the cabinets, beyond the BJP's elder statesmen, there's a young team of people, young men and women, usually under 25, who are part of the inner think tank of Mr. Modi, who provide the technological support, who run his social media campaign, and as you may have heard, that even today, that now, after Obama, there's no other leader in the world who has as many followers on the social media as Mr. Modi has. So it's this inner think tank of young, brilliant, charismatic Indians, many of whom have studied in Ivy League schools or Oxbridge and are working pro bono, who championed the cause of Modi and helped create this wider, larger-than-life image of Modi. So, on the one hand, you had this young India, aspirational with no avenues, and Modi seen as a great hope. At the same time, you have an India which seems to be losing out economically. Beyond the first promises of the 1990s liberal reforms, India is stalling, stagnating. There are scams in every direction, led by an honest Prime Minister, who I still respect, Manmohan Singh, who seemed to have lost all grips over his government. The world is losing faith in Modi. Corporate India the world is losing faith in Manmohan Singh in India. Corporate India is losing faith in the government. The development challenges that India is facing are becoming more and more serious. Even today, as you may well know, 50% of Indians live on less than $1 a day. So you had poor Indians having no sense of hope and rich corporate India fearing that the government of India has lost all sense of direction. And there again, they see in what Modi has done in Gujarat. Of course, you can continue to debate whether the growth story of Gujarat has been inclusive enough or not. The fact remains that you have had people from all over India work in Gujarat, send back money to their homes, in some ways acting as messengers for the Gujarat and the Modi story. And then you have the compelling story when dynasties and money power seems to be the only way into enter politics. And if you did a survey of the last parliament, and if you did a survey of who gets elected, unless your father or your mother is a political leader, or unless you're a billionaire in your own right, there are slim chances of you entering Indian Parliament, and even slimmer chances of you ever occupying a position of decision-making as a minister, or as a junior minister, as a cabinet minister. And here, on the other hand, is the compelling story of someone who's really made it on his own. When you have the story of someone whose father sold tea, who at the age of 15 or 16 went away in search of salvation, wanting to lead a kind of monastic life, was turned away by the monks of the Ramakrishna mission, and thereafter joined the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh as a pracharak, as a preacher, and continued, although having been married as a child, continued that Spartan, bachelor-like, celibate existence until he became Chief Minister of Gujarat. Not comfortable with English, isn't seen as part of this Macaulay's generations created by Imperial Britain, connected to the grassroots, a compelling narrative. Never had Indian politics been prepared, never had India ever thought that you could actually have someone with such humble roots take on the mighty and the powerful and all the dynasties within, indeed, even the BJP, and of course, within the Congress. So India needed Modi because India was losing faith in itself. Young India was losing faith with whatever was going on in India, but everyone else was losing faith in the economic story of India, in the way in which India was being governed. And therefore, the Modi story and the election of Modi was in some ways a foregone conclusion. Months before, this is the only time that I remember that even a year before the election, everyone knew that Narendra Modi would be the Prime Minister of India. You didn't need to be a rocket scientist or a political scientist like Harold Lasky to be able to predict that Narendra Modi would become Prime Minister. Now, that's why India needed Modi. Why did Australia-India relations need Modi? Now, I've often spoken at great risk about the three Australians who we should value for their contribution towards Asia and India. And I've been criticized, to use a gentle word, by both liberals and Labour supporters alike, because I include three very different figures. Alfred Deakin, Tony Abbott, and Gough Whitlam. And of course, much of this, or what I'm saying, is really plagiarized from the profound scholarship of Meg Gurry, who I'll embarrass again as describing her as the world's greatest historian of India-Australia relations, and whose book, as the chairman pointed out, we are privileged to publish, and which will be out early next year. And anyone interested in Australia-India relations must read that book. Now, Alfred Deakin, who was born, Robert, close to where you live, 90 George Street, Fitzroy, and second Prime Minister of the Federation of India, the Federation of Australia, first Attorney General, contributor to The Age, Sushi, in a different age. I saw Sushi Das somewhere. Yeah. Sushi Das, opinion editor, greatly valued friend of the Institute. Thank you for being here. But in The Age those days had obviously not just the power to persuade Deakin to become from a free marketeer to a protectionist, but also to send him to India. And Deakin wrote on the irrigation system of India, wrote on temples of India, and all the other kind of archaeological religious sites of India, came back, not just converted to the idea of India in many ways, but converted also to theosophy. He was a great theosophist for most of his life after he came back from India. So Deakin's exploration and the articles he wrote for The Age, I think, represented that first burst of engagement with India and Asia after Australia had become a federation. The tragedy of Australia-India relations was that after India became independent, you had a brief glimmer of hope when Nehru and Chifley seemed to have engaged very well. But then you had the tragedy that two longest-standing prime ministers of both India and Australia, Jawaharlal Nehru and Robert Menzies, didn't get along, didn't think similarly on virtually any issue. Whether it was non-alignment, and Menzies could never understand what non-alignment meant, and probably would have argued, like Dulles did, that non-alignment was immoral, and also later on admitted that the Occidental imagination was not really capable of understanding India. Menzies saw himself clearly as part of the Anglosphere, and the East belonging somewhere different. And towards the end of his tenure as Prime Minister in the 60s, he seemed to have shifted a little. But for the most, Menzies did not believe that there was a great scope for engaging with India. In contrast, of course, and I know there could be Whitlamites in this room, and there could be those who think Whitlam was the greatest disaster that happened to Australia. I happen to belong perhaps to the former group, because I think, and I know the chairman might disagree, that much of that is, and I'll risk stating it as an exaggeration to provoke you into perhaps questioning me, but I think that much of that is good about Australia today. We owe at least to the vision, if not the administrative fluency and efficiency of the Whitlam era, with its really, and I know that whenever I speak about Whitlam, there's at least one person in the audience who gets up and says, I wouldn't have gone to university if it hadn't been for Whitlam. Is there anyone in here who can say we wouldn't have gone to university? Good, great. Yeah, we're in Melbourne University, so this is privilege, but still we have, 3 hands get up and say that they wouldn't have gone to university if it hadn't been for Whitlam. But Whitlam reached out to China before the great realist duo of Kissinger and Nixon had thought of making the opening to China. Whitlam never reacted ballistically like Downer did when India tested nuclear weapons in 1974. Whitlam had genuine empathy, affection, and understanding of India. I remember in distant Kashmir, the first time I heard of Whitlam, and what a shock it created in a small Kashmiri Pandit household was when he was dismissed. Because Whitlam was seen as a person who was modernizing Australia. And if you hear that fantastic tribute to Whitlam by Noel Pearson, you'll remember how much of a difference he made to even the most marginal groups in this country, but also externally to what seemed to be the most marginal relationships, like with India before Whitlam. Now you might say, you talk about Whitlam, and then you talk about Abbott. Menzies, when he decided that he will not send a representative to the Bandung conference, clearly indicated that he didn't understand Asia, didn't understand this new world, and didn't really have much of a rapport or trust for this world. In contrast, when Abbott went in September this year, and at a press conference, someone asked him, Mr. Abbott, Australia has decided to sign the civil nuclear agreement with India, first time with a country which is not a signatory to the NPT. Why are you doing this? And he said, because, and I'm paraphrasing, we trust India. In that one sentence, that we trust India, he had bridged a gulf of nearly 60 years of history between one conservative politician and another, between Menzies and Abbott. I know there are those in this room who may disagree with almost everything that Abbott does domestically, but I'm really looking at his engagement with India. And I find in these 3 individuals, you can capsule the whole narrative of Australia's engagement with India. But Abbott's visit came when the great puzzle of international relations was not, why should India and Australia do more business with each other? Why are 2 countries with so much in common by way of both values and interests not doing more with each other? And ultimately, in all the 3 years that I spent time advocating, writing about this relationship, I realized that it was ultimately a question of trust. It was ultimately a question of trust which could be bridged only if there was a chemistry at the highest level. And let me say this, that everything that has happened between September, 36-para memorandum, and the new Defense and Security Cooperation Agreement signed during the Modi visit would never have happened if you had let the bureaucrats decide the relationship. With due apologies to Mike Moniad, I have the greatest amount of respect, and I know there are diplomats who have served in the Australian High Commission in India, but bureaucrats in every country are, for want of a better word, status quo and reactionaries. They're risk averse. You require the political leadership, the vision, the statesmanship, and almost sometimes the willingness to be adventurous before you can actually transform relations. So you needed a Modi as much as you needed an Abbott to really transform this relationship in the way that it's been done. Really not in a period of months or years, between September and November. And if you look at it, what is power? And I know this is a one-on-one political science question, but power is the ability to influence others, to do what you want of them, through military means, through economic means, or through soft power. And in this visit, you've seen all three instruments of power, whether it's in terms of military, much greater military collaboration between the two countries. For the first time, I've seen Australia, after, not the first time, but after they had initially agreed to the quadrilateral dialogue, be much more or much less cagey about defense cooperation with India. And that's evident in the framework which has been adopted, whether it is in terms of maritime exercises, whether it is in terms of greater defense-to-defense talks, whether it is in terms of greater cooperation on cybersecurity against terrorism. There's a whole menu of options which was there, but was there on the table because no one had the political will to drive it. Similarly, and this is a kind of plug for our own CEOs roundtable, the governor hosted a roundtable for 30 CEOs with Prime Minister Modi. In the past, I found Australian CEOs almost totally bearish about India. And this was reflected in the fact that you had the big businesses enter India after the liberalization of the early 90s and then pull back. Telstra went in, could have been a pioneer in the largest mobile network market in the world, but shied away because they found India too difficult to deal with. ANZ went in, came back, is going in again. But generally speaking, even till last year, there used to be a board member of ours who used to tell us, it's so difficult doing business with India. And on the other hand, Peter Verghese, who was the secretary of DFAT, used to say, remember, India will try your patience, but it will always reward the patient. But Mr. Modi's electrifying impact has been such that you have Gina Reinhardt of Hancock Prospecting, and just in this picture, you have Andrew McKinsey, you have the treasurer, you have Jennifer Westacott, you have our chairman, Robert Johansson, you had the Lindsay Fox, you had anyone who's anyone. You had Anthony Pratt wanting to do business with India. I began my introductory remarks in this roundtable by saying that never have I seen the creme de la creme of Australian businesses descend from their corporate offices and come in for an engagement with the Indian Prime Minister, and never have I seen them more enthusiastic and engaged. To the point that Anthony Pratt, you'll be delighted to know, especially the Friends of the Australia-India Institute, has just given us $500,000 to run an Australia-India leadership dialogue on the same lines as the Australia-US dialogue or the Australia-Israel dialogue. And it has been because of the electrifying impact that Modi has had on audiences domestically, energizing domestic audiences and wowing audiences internationally. But it's really, now you would never have thought that Modi had soft power. Once a very able political scientist described him as a textbook fascist. Ashish Nandi, on the record. So soft power is the ability to seduce someone because you're so attractive. It's the ability to coerce you to doing something and without you realizing that you're doing that. And yet, if there was a defining feature of Mr. Modi's visit, was his charisma, was his rock star-like quality, was his unbridled energy, enthusiasm. My favorite image of the Modi visit was in the MCG dinner, where one of the the richest woman in Australia had her iPad, really smuggled herself between Mr. Abbott and Mr. Modi, and took a selfie of herself. That was Gina Reinhardt. Or the fact that every one of Modi's bureaucrats on the last evening at the MCG said, and I knew them personally, and I said, how has it been? They said, it's terrific. But you know, I think we're all going to collapse. I said, why? What happened? He said, yesterday we did Brisbane, Sydney, Canberra in one day, about 8 meetings. We slept for 1 hour. Tonight we have done 2 meetings. We have had a bilateral. Mr. Modi's addressed Parliament in Canberra. He's done a bilateral with Mr. Abbott. He's done. This is the 5th meeting in Melbourne, and now we are flying in a small aircraft to Fiji, where we'll not be able to sleep. There are no reclining seats, and we'll sleep for just in about an hour. He says everyone else is collapsing except one man, and Mr. Modi looked like he just got up after 16 hours of sleeping, fresh, completely formidable, making another grand speech. No one, I must say that I, as an Indian, was not quite prepared by the way Modi has taken the world by storm, and not just because I thought that he'll focus domestically. But in the last 6 months, he's traveled to the United States, to Brazil, to Japan, to Nepal, to Bhutan, hosted Xi Jinping from China, hosted the Vietnamese Prime Minister, hosted a scores of other visitors, including all the South Asian leaders. This is unprecedented. No other Indian Prime Minister in recent memory has traveled for so many places in such a short period of time. Okay. Now we're going to show you a video which COG has compiled from Modi's, the best of Modi in Australia. Now you notice that he gives his speech. First of all, he gives it in English. He delivers it fluently. Anecdotally, 90% of the people who heard this didn't realize that there was a teleprompter there. There's an audio cue which is almost invisible if you see it on television. In fact, I spoke to people back home, and they thought that he was just delivering it extempore. But that's the benefits of technology. And apparently, Prime Minister Abbott had requested him to speak in English to contrast it with the President Xi Jinping's address as well. And he makes this huge impact in Parliament, but this is really only part of the story, because what he has done before that in Brisbane is similar. Or what he did in Sydney with the diaspora is similar to what he did in Madison Square Gardens. And he, apart from the technological team, he has a small but very effective research team, which dug up all the various connections that Australia has with India. So you had him talking about Burley Griffin and how who designed Canberra and is now buried in a cemetery in Lucknow, and how we need to celebrate his work, or the work of John Lang, the great lawyer from Sydney, who went and defended many of those who were being tried during the first war of Indian independence, or the Great Mutiny, as some like to call it. So all these connections, and he brought them to bear in all the various speeches, engagements, addresses that he delivered. No one was quite prepared, I dare say, for the impact that Modi had on Australia, had on the diaspora. And of course, he's galvanizing the diaspora as no one has in the past. And he galvanized it here as well, at the Sydney, at the All Folds Arena. There were 16,000 people inside that auditorium, in that stadium, but you had about 10,000 at least outside waiting to hear or seeing him on screens outside. But that's about the Australian story. Why does the world, clearly now Australia needs India for its economic relationship, for its security relationship, and for all the other ways in which Australia has related with other partners. In fact, I keep saying to all those who say Britain for tradition, America for security, China for continued economic success, that India for the future, because every one of these collapse in the India relationship, whether it's the tradition, whether it's the economic resilience, or whether it's geostrategy in the Asia-Pacific region. Finally, why does the world need Modi? Clearly, and I hope Pradeep disputes what I say, clearly because everyone who is thinking and who's not blinded by the affection for the Central Communist Party or the Politburo of the Communist Party realizes that China, the present leadership of China, and Xi Jinping, unarguably is probably the most powerful Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping, if not even more powerful, that China feels that it has arrived on the world stage and that it must have the space, the influence, which great powers have done in the past. So you have every one of China's neighbors, save perhaps Pakistan and North Korea, nervous about China. And some people say even North Korea is now nervous about China. But there's not a single Chinese neighbor. Even Cambodia that I visited is now nervous about China, even though it's become virtually a Chinese colony. But still, the level of Chinese aggressiveness in the last 1 year has been such that you hope that there's some kind of balance, that there is no single power hegemonizing this region, particularly at a time when the greatest disappointment for left and right alone has been the decline of the West, represented in the decline of America, decline of the power of the American presidents, decline in the influence of America in the region. In absolute terms, as many of the indicators demonstrate, America will remain the single most powerful economic and military power for the next 30 years, till 2050 perhaps. But power is not just about absolute capacities, but intentions, influence, and the manner in which you're able to actually harness all the various instruments of power to bring that to bear on the policies that you want to formulate and implement. And the US seems, at least under this president, in serious decline. At that time, when China is rising, America seems to be withdrawing, even though they keep saying whether it's pivot or the new balance, the fact remains that you don't see real hard evidence for a renewed, vigorous engagement with this region. And because you're faced within this idea called the Asian century, where really is like the Roman god Janus, symbolizing both war and peace, beginnings and endings, symbolizing two sides to the Asian century, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as some people call it, an economic powerhouse called Asia, which will replicate what was happening in Asia before the Industrial Revolution in Europe, that 40% of all the world's GDP will come from China and India in the next 10, 15 years. And yet, the other side of the Asian century is that it resembles 19th century Europe. The future is the economic story. The past is the 19th century balance of power Europe, territorial disputes, jockeying for influence and power, and then, therefore, the great wars of the last century. Within this Asia of a declining America, a rising China, and a Janus-faced Asian century, everyone wants an India to at least provide some form of a balance. And Modi is seen as someone who has at least the vision, the courage, if not quite yet the means, to be able to give India that face. So the world needed Modi, India certainly needed Modi, and Australia-India relations needed someone with the kind of chutzpah that only Modi has, the kind of audacity to come to Australia and really take it by storm, or go to America, where he was denied a visa for 10 years and take it by storm again. The question is, we've seen Modi, the rock star, perform. Now we have to see Modi, the real political actor, deliver on the ground, because the appeal of the rock star can vanish once your CD is no longer on the charts. But what will really count for India, this bilateral relationship in the world, is if Modi delivers on the promise of India. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitabh. So we have some time for comment or questions.
Andrew Kingsford. As you've observed, during his honeymoon period, Mr. Modi can be all things to all men without any political danger. However, you stressed that he rides on a wave of youth enthusiasm, so to speak. I would argue that analysing the world in terms of generations is a notoriously imprecise unit of social science, and I'm just wondering when are fissures in this youth wave likely to become evident when Mr. Modi's honeymoon period reaches its possible conclusion?
I mean, your guess is as good as mine. I used youth as an independent variable only because it was clear that the vast majority of Modi's voters were first-time voters, being given voting rights at the age of 18, and clearly they were the ones who had led the anti-corruption movement. They were young, angry, impatient. So while I could use many other independent variables, this one is the one which is most striking, which has at least anecdotally and even in terms of the evidence available, the strongest correlationship between the Modi victory and this independent variable.
Yes. Peter Myron here. You didn't mention all these achievements as the Chief Minister of Gujarat. There's a lot of people in this room who would not know what his great achievements were in Gujarat and what's his future, his vision for all India, and that I've heard comments from people on the Modi Express, oh, he's like Gandhi, he's a visionary, but is he this though and that, you know? But can you tell me his great achievements that he did for Gujarat and what's he going to do for all India as now the Prime Minister? Thank you.
I think I pointed out, obviously one doesn't have the time to go through all the achievements, nor indeed am I a student of Gujarat politics to be able to tell you all that. So all that I'll say is anecdotal or hearsay, but certainly that hearsay was powerful enough for people to have faith in him, to vote him into power 3 times. And that is, he created a relatively corrupt-free administration in a country where corruption is endemic. He created an investor-friendly environment, and he ensured that the bulk of the Gujarati people had access to basic services, electricity, water, health. Now that's the proposition that he was able to transform. Now Gujarat, remember, is in any case an enterprising state with a great spirit of individual and collective civil action, but he clearly ensured he did much more than other chief ministers. Moreover, after the riots of 2002, there hasn't been a single communal riot of any proportion until Modi went as Prime Minister, and then there's been recently a riot again in Gujarat.
What should be the few top things that you think should Modi do or need to do to prove that he has delivered on his promises that he has made in Australia?
I think Modi has talked about 2 planks, which I think are quite apart from the provision of basic services: Clean India, Skill India, and Build India. And I've said this ad nauseum, which is that you have this huge youthful population which, if provided with the proper skills, given proper training and education, and given the right values of global citizenship, could potentially become a global workforce in a world which is otherwise aging. On the other hand, unskilled, not being injected with the right values, and certainly with no aspirations and no jobs, they could become not just India's, but a global nightmare. I think that has to be the first priority of skilling. And then you have to build the infrastructure which will provide the opportunities for employment. 100 smart cities he's talked about. That's a huge vision. I think on the other hand, he's focused on something which he keeps saying, that I'm not someone who's talked about big issues. I also talk about small issues like Clean India, which, given that he comes from Varanasi, which is the holiest city for all Hindus, and is also probably the dirtiest city in the world, he has promised to clean India, beginning with Varanasi, beginning with the Ganges. And that is connected to the Gandhian vision that sanitation or cleanliness is next to godliness.
Bob Smith, I'd preface my question by saying I'm a regular visitor to Varanasi, and I can vouch both for the holiness and for the filthiness. And I can say that many of my friends in Varanasi are very keen to see what Mr. Modi can do, which leads to my question. Mr. Modi is a very successful chief minister. A prime minister's job is rather different. We know from experience in Australia, we know from experience in India, that scaling up from state level to federal level is difficult. Can you say a bit about how Mr. Modi is going on that score? And the second thing is, over the last few years, there's been a bubbling up in Delhi amongst the civil servants about a look for some political leadership that can drive the cart. How much is Mr. Modi doing on this front, and how do you rate his prospects? Thank you.
I mean, there have been no big bang reforms as yet, economic reforms. Politically, he's been much more adventurous, for instance, calling Shiv Sena's bluff in Maharashtra. But what he said, that the last budget was an interim budget, and you will see the beginnings of those big bang reforms in the next budget. But in terms of his style of governing, almost everyone I met in Gujarat, when Ravi and I were there for the Vibrant Gujarat Summit, couldn't name a second minister in his cabinet. Anandiben was the closest that most people would get to remember recalling a second minister. If the Gujarat cabinet was a cricket team, Mr. Modi was number 1 to number 11. There would be a 12th man. And he would empower bureaucrats and delegate power to them. And once they had earned his confidence and trust, he would give them a complete carte blanche to deliver. Now, everyone said he won't be able to do that in India. India is far too complex. India is far too huge for Modi to do it. Modi may not be the full cricket team in India if the Indian cabinet was a cricket team, but he's certainly, even today, 1 to 9, there might be a Arun Jaitley and a Rajnath Singh who might figure as tail enders, but the whole cricket team is Modi. Not even a minister, which is unusual for India and not unusual for Australia, can appoint anyone to his personal staff without the clearance of the Prime Minister's office. No single appointment is made without the clearance of the Prime Minister's office. Secretaries can speak to Mr. Modi, have separate meetings with Mr. Modi. Now, someone yesterday said, oh, this reminds me of Kevin Rudd. Now, that's a different story.
We have a question from the Twitter sphere.
Yes, we've got one here from Srinivas Mohan, who has said, do you think it is right for a PM to project himself ahead of his country? Is it right to run down institutions? And I think a good one to finish off with from Ankit Agrawal, which is, what, according to you, is the most important takeaway from PM Modi's visit to Australia?
First question, if Modi was an academic writing a textbook on politics, surely, he would emphasize institutions and importance of institutions, but he's now a leader, and obviously he has a vision. And hopefully that vision will also mean in strengthening institutions, and that he will not, beyond a point, transcend those institutions. Secondly, I think the takeoff has been one big takeoff is that more and more Australians have been exposed to the India story. The India story is part of the mainstream of Australian public life. All through the east coast of Australia, you had a Modi impact. This could be completely ephemeral. This could be just passing. But I don't, and Robin Jeffrey and Meg Gurry are probably better equipped to answer that. Do you remember a time, Meg or Robin, when you had the same kind of impact of a single visit? I mean, you can count the number of prime ministers who visited this country, Indian prime ministers, on the fingers of your hands. You had Rajiv Gandhi and Hawke bonding, and that was one moment. You had Indira Gandhi visit La Trobe University when John Gorton invited her in 1968 and then come back for the Commonwealth Summit. But I'm not a historian of Australia-India relations, but I don't think from my secondary readings of Robin's and Meg's works, do I remember anything happening like this?
Yeah, just somebody asked here a moment ago what were his concrete achievements. I've observed this over the last few years, and I can name 3 or 4 very easily. And that is, he has an attribute of being able to understand a problem, to understand the solution being offered, and delegate the solution to be executed. Case in point was the Gujarat power grid for agricultural use, separation of the power grid between domestic use and agricultural use and industrial use. And therefore, everyone has power by 7 by 24 basis. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
So I think we're running a bit over time. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to those of you who are looking in from outside. Once again, we've had the great delight to hear from Amitabh speak in his usual expansive but insightful way on these big issues. Amitabh, this isn't quite the farewell or the end, but this is just another example of the enormous contribution that he's made to the life of this university and of the relationship between Australia and India. And I'd like you to join with me in thanking him again.